As we've seen a couple of times over the last few weeks, the Pharisees gave every effort to trip Jesus up with questions that were designed to trap him into saying something damaging. This week, it seems that they are at it again. This time, the inquisitor has asked Jesus which is the most important of the commandments in the law. So before we go any further, I'm going to ask you, how many commandments were there that Jesus was being asked to choose from? And that's not rhetorical. I really am looking for answers. What do you think? What? 10? What? The Old Testament scholar in the choir is correct. There are actually 613 commandments, yes, in the law. Most Christians tend to think in terms of the 10 commandments when we think about the law. But actually, every time that God says you shall or you shall not is considered, in Jewish tradition, is considered a commandment. Now, just because it's interesting to ask, do you know what the first commandment is then in the Old Testament? Not the first as they were asking Jesus, but like chronologically, beginning at the beginning and going through the Old Testament, what's the first one you run into? Anybody? Be fruitful and multiply. Cheryl and I are having a great conversation here. You guys want to join in or just... Yes, be fruitful and multiply. That's the first time God tells the first couple that this is what you are to do, and so that's the first commandment. Okay, all right. So most folks don't realize that all of those times when God says thou shalt or thou shalt not, that those are considered commandments. So in the New Testament, our New Testament lesson that I just read, when the Pharisee challenges Jesus with that question of which one of those is the greatest, the Pharisee's trying to trick Jesus a little bit, trying to trick him into saying something that'll get him into trouble. It's an invitation to an unwinnable argument. No matter which of the laws Jesus chooses, the Pharisee will be able to argue that a different law is more important. You see, if there's 613 laws and they are considered to be equal, it'd be hard to make a case for one being more important than all the others. It'd be similar to someone asking you, of all the traffic laws in the state of Ohio, which one is most important? Thou shalt not exceed the speed limit. Thou shalt not run a stop sign. Thou shalt not text and drive. Thou shalt not drink and drive. Here's another question for you. Is it okay to disregard the traffic laws in case of an emergency? Show of hands. If it's okay to disregard a traffic law in cases of an emergency. Come on, be bold, sin boldly, get them up there. All right, okay, thank you for playing along. I appreciate that. You're wrong, though. I promise I'll ask you a question to respond to one time when you'll be right, and you'll be able to pat yourselves on the back and feel good. But today you're wrong. No. You're actually not allowed to do that. And there's a man in Calhoun County, Iowa, who actually found this out the hard way just last week. He was stopped while driving his wife, who was in labor, to the hospital. They did get to the hospital on time, but the man who claimed to have been listening to his wife, who was in a tremendous amount of pain at the time and told him not to stop for the police officer trying to pull him over, he was given a ticket for driving 86 in a 55 and also for failure to yield to an emergency vehicle. So there was a case of somebody trying to prioritize laws and it didn't work out well for him. The digest of Ohio motor vehicle laws is over 80 pages long and contains hundreds of laws that govern how citizens of the state of Ohio are required to operate a motor vehicle. Now, I didn't take the time to count them all, and trust me though, there are a lot of them. And we're expected to know them all and obey them. But over and above these individual laws is a single principle that connects them all: public safety. Every law, individually and as a system, is intended to make it safer for you when you are operating a motor vehicle and safer for us when you are operating a motor vehicle. So if someone asked you, what is the most important traffic law? A good answer might be safe. All of the traffic laws in the state of Ohio are based on that one idea. And that's essentially the way that Jesus is replying to the Pharisee when he's questioned about the law. Jesus does select two to be the greatest. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind comes from Deuteronomy 6, while love your neighbor is found in Leviticus 19. And the Pharisees might have had an open door, or the Pharisee might have had an open door to criticize Jesus' answer, except that Jesus then goes on to say that these two laws form the basis on which all other laws are founded. In his commentary on this passage, Tom Long writes that what Jesus claims is that the whole law is about love, not rules, about really loving God and one's neighbor, not about figuring out how to avoid stepping on cracks in the legal sidewalk. The Pharisee might have been able to argue that thou shalt not kill is more important than love God and love your neighbor, but he couldn't argue the point that all the law is based in the fundamental truth of God's love for us and in the expectation that we will respond in kind. In our Judeo-Christian tradition, the central act of God's relationship with Israel was the exodus from Egypt. In a supreme act of mercy and love, God reaches out to a slave people and delivers them from bondage into a land of their own. God's law is an expression of that love. It's given not as a means of punishing or of restraining or of replacing one brand of slavery with another. The law was given, according to Jewish thought, as a means of helping the people to appropriately respond to God. How do the people govern themselves as a nation special to God? The law shows them the way. How do the people set themselves apart from the tribes and nations that surround them as a people of God? The law teaches them how. At its core, the law is not about restrictions or judgment. The law is not fundamentally a way for God to show us how bad we are. It is an expression of God's love for us. And its greatest requirement is that we love God and one another. Now, of the two, loving God is probably the easier one. It's not hard to love God, who makes us who we are and gives us all that we have. When I think about my children and my wife and the roof over my head and the food that we get to eat, I am able to say thank you to God for filling my life to overflowing. But when Jesus says that the second of the greatest laws is to love your neighbor as yourself, well, that's where things get a little bit trickier. Because people aren't always lovable. Thumb through a newspaper just about any morning, and you'll find lots of examples of people who aren't very lovable. Get stuck in traffic on High Street at about 5 o'clock on any given afternoon, and you're likely to meet a couple of them. Talk to people when they haven't eaten all day, or when they've just been diagnosed with something dreadful, or when they need help, but you just don't have what they need, and you have to send them away empty-handed. And you might come away feeling like those people weren't very lovable either. As a minister, I get to see people at their worst sometimes, at their most lonely, their most afraid, their most angry, their most aggrieved. Just about everybody has bad moments, and when we're feeling our worst, we are often at our least lovable. And not only that, but people are just different, and that makes them hard to love sometimes too. If you're on Facebook at all, you've probably experienced that a few times yourself. That political figure that you think is an idiot, turns out your best friend in high school loves that guy. And when your favorite team loses on Saturday afternoon, the next day you'll be reminded of how many of your friends actually despise your favorite team. And whatever your feelings about contemporary issues like same-sex marriage or gun control or the Common Core curriculum standards, your news feed will be peppered with posts from friends who feel exactly the opposite. And as you scratch your head over how apparently sane, well-educated people could hold that particular opinion or belief, you might have a hard time finding them to be lovable. You may have noticed the sizable dent that's been newly applied to the driver's side door of my truck. The Cliff's Notes version of that story is that a driver failed to yield the right-of-way while entering Highway 315, which led to my taking evasive action, skidding on a rain-soaked road and hitting a third car. Everybody was okay, but the driver of the first car that caused the chain of events to happen drove away. I'll be honest and say that I have a hard time finding that guy to be very lovable. And yet God says the greatest of the laws is that we love God and we love one another. And there are no boundaries or conditions set on who is included in one another. That means we have to love everybody. How's that possible? Invariably, when I tell people this, somebody will ask me, well, what about Osama bin Laden and Adolf Hitler? Am I supposed to love them too? Well, for starters, they're both dead. But yeah, you have to love them too. But a question like that completely confuses the issue because of our cultural ideas about what love is. There's a comic strip. It's written and drawn by Kim Casale that features two cherubic figures and the words, love is ... And each day, she finishes that sentence with love is something else. The one for this morning says that love is walking barefoot in the grass together. Other days, Casale has enthused that love is a shoulder to cry on. Love is a smile that lights up your day. And love is when it's just great being together. But that's not really what Jesus is talking about here. So maybe if we are going to be able to understand what Jesus is talking about, we need to define our terms a little better. In Paul's first letter to the church in Corinth, we find an excellent definition of what love is. 1 Corinthians 13, verses 4 through 8, Paul writes, love is patient, love is kind, love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. Now, you've probably heard that once or twice at a wedding. It's where it gets read an awful lot. But I find that very interesting because Paul is not celebrating the love between a married couple. Paul is actually chastising the Corinthians for what they are failing to do. Because in Corinth, they seem to be misunderstanding what it meant to love God and one another. So Paul was trying to set them straight. And in so doing, Paul clears up for exactly what is expected of us when we are told that the greatest of the laws is to love God and our neighbors. You see, Paul uses a lot of words to define love, but he never talks about feelings. Love's not about where our emotion takes us. Love is about where we actively choose to go. Love is not about what we feel. Love is about what we do. And that's why Jesus never says to go out and hug the hungry and smile at the thirsty. And that's why Jesus never says to cultivate warm, fuzzy feelings for your enemy. Jesus doesn't tell us that we have to like everybody. Jesus tells us that we have to love everybody. And love means being patient and kind when someone else is being ugly. Love means not insisting on your own way every time. It means responding to people in ways that are not irritable or resentful, even when their behavior might warrant such a response. Love means not assuming the worst, but giving each other the benefit of the doubt. Love means trying to know one another and understand one another, and sometimes, when none of that's possible, love means walking away and maybe trying again later. Feeling love is easy, but doing love is hard, especially the way that Paul defines it. It takes work, and it takes persistence, and it takes dedication. For Jesus, loving God means loving one another, and loving one another means loving God, and you can't do the one without the other. So remember, you don't have to like everybody, but you do have to love everybody. It's the law. So to God be all glory, honor, power, and dominion in this world and in the world that is to come. Amen.